My name is Vivian, and I am 33 years old. 16 years ago, my family drugged me, put me on a plane, and shipped me to a facility in Eastern Europe designed to break the spirits of children that wealthy families wanted to disappear. They told everyone I was mentally disturbed. They told everyone I was a danger to myself and others. They told everyone that sending me away was an act of love, a desperate intervention for a troubled girl who couldn't be helped by conventional means. They lied. I wasn't disturbed. I wasn't dangerous. I was simply inconvenient. I was the obstacle standing between my aunt and uncle and $50 million that my grandmother had intended to leave to me. So they got rid of me. They erased me. They buried me alive in a concrete building 10,000 miles from home and expected me to disappear forever. But I didn't disappear. I survived. I escaped. I built something they could never have imagined. And now, 16 years later, they're about to discover that the crazy girl they threw away became the most powerful person in their entire world. But before we dive into this, globe showing Europe, Africa, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country, your city, your state in the comments below. Globe showing Americas. Are you watching from the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, India, the Philippines, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, Japan? I want to know where in the world this story is reaching, because stories like this, stories about survival, about justice, about proving everyone wrong, they resonate everywhere. They cross borders. They speak to something universal in all of us. So comment right now and tell me where you're tuning in from. And while you're at it, subscribe to this channel, bell. I grew up in what most people would consider extraordinary privilege. My family, the Harringtons, had built a real estate empire over 3 generations, accumulating properties across the eastern seaboard and establishing themselves as one of the wealthiest families in our region. My grandfather, William Harrington SR, had started with nothing, a single hardware store that he parlayed into construction, then development, then commercial real estate. By the time he died, the family holdings were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But wealth, I learned early, doesn't guarantee love. In fact, it often guarantees the opposite. Wealth creates incentives for cruelty, for manipulation, for treating people as obstacles rather than human beings. My father was the youngest of 3 children. His older brother, Richard, was the golden child, charming, ambitious, utterly ruthless. His older sister, Margaret, had married into another wealthy family and largely stayed out of Harrington affairs. My father, James, was the sensitive one, the artist, the one who never quite fit the mold that the family expected. He married my mother, Elena, a woman from a modest background who loved him for who he was rather than what he had. They had me when he was 28, and for the first few years of my life, we lived in a bubble of warmth and happiness that existed slightly apart from the larger Harrington drama. That bubble burst when I was 7 years old. My parents died in a car accident, a drunk driver running a red light, a collision that killed them both instantly. I was at home with a babysitter when it happened, watching cartoons and eating popcorn, completely unaware that my entire world was about to collapse. The question of who would raise me became a matter of intense negotiation within the family. My mother had no living relatives who could take me in. My Aunt Margaret expressed some interest, but was quickly overruled by her husband, who didn't want the complication. That left Uncle Richard and his wife, Patricia, who stepped forward with what appeared to be generous concern for their orphaned niece. "Of course we'll take her," Richard told the family attorney. "She's blood. She belongs with us." I was too young to understand what was really happening. I didn't know that my grandmother, Dorothy, had recently updated her will to leave a substantial portion of her estate, $50 million, directly to me, bypassing Richard entirely. I didn't know that Richard had expected to inherit everything and was furious that his mother had chosen to favor his dead brother's child over him. I didn't know that from the moment I moved into Richard and Patricia's house, I was living with people who saw me as a threat to their fortune and were already planning how to neutralize me. For the first few years, they were clever about it. They enrolled me in the same private school as their own children, my cousins Alexander and Charlotte, and provided me with all the material comforts that wealth could offer. To outside observers, they were model guardians, opening their home to a grieving child and raising her alongside their own. But inside that house, the reality was different. It started with small things. Meals where I was served last, given smaller portions, seated at the far end of the table. Vacations where I was left with housekeepers while the real family went to Europe. Birthday parties that were elaborate for Alexander and Charlotte but barely acknowledged for me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My cousins, taking their cues from their parents, learned to treat me as lesser. Alexander, 3 years older than me, ignored me entirely. I wasn't worth his attention. Charlotte, 1 year younger, was crueler. She had inherited her mother's talent for subtle cruelty, for insults disguised as concern. "It's so sad that you don't have real parents anymore," she would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I can't imagine how hard it must be to know that you're only here because of charity." I tried to talk to my grandmother about what was happening, but she was growing older and more frail, and Richard had positioned himself as her primary caretaker. My visits with her became increasingly supervised, increasingly brief, increasingly controlled. "Grandmother, I don't think Uncle Richard likes me," I told her once when I was 10. She had looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. "Your uncle has his flaws, Vivian, but I've made sure you'll be taken care of. No matter what happens, you'll have what you need. I've made sure of it." I didn't understand then what she meant. I wouldn't understand for years. The pivot point came when I was 13. My grandmother's health had been declining for months, and the family knew the end was near. Richard had been spending more and more time with her, managing her affairs, positioning himself as the devoted son. One evening, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I had come downstairs to get a glass of water, moving quietly because I had learned that being quiet made me less of a target. Richard's study door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him speaking with Patricia in tense, urgent tones. "The will is ironclad," Richard was saying. "I've had 3 lawyers look at it. The old woman was completely lucid when she signed it, and there's no way to challenge it on competency grounds." "Then what do we do?" Patricia asked. $50 million, Richard. 50 million that should be ours, going to that girl." "I know." Richard's voice was tight with frustration. "If she weren't in the picture, the money would flow to us as next of kin. But as long as she's a legitimate heir." There was a long pause. "What if she wasn't legitimate?" Patricia's voice had dropped, taking on a calculating quality that made my blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if she wasn't capable of inheriting? What if she were incapacitated in some way, declared incompetent?" Another pause. "That would require documentation, medical records, a diagnosis." "We know people, Richard, people who can provide documentation, and there are places, facilities, that specialize in handling troubled children, children who need to be removed from situations for their own good." "You're talking about having her committed." "I'm talking about protecting our family's interests. The girl is clearly disturbed. Anyone can see it. She's withdrawn, antisocial, probably traumatized from her parents' death. It wouldn't be hard to build a case that she needs professional help. Intensive, long-term professional help. Somewhere far away where she can get the care she needs." I stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe. They were talking about me. They were talking about getting rid of me. "And while she's getting this care," Richard asked, "we would manage her affairs. As her guardians, we would have control over her inheritance until she's able to manage it herself, which of course might never happen. These facilities, they're designed to keep people there, indefinitely if necessary." Richard was silent, for what felt like an eternity. "Let me make some calls," he said finally. "I know people who have handled similar situations, but this has to be done carefully. We can't have anyone questioning our motives." Of course, we're doing this for her benefit. We're concerned family members taking action to help a troubled child. I fled back to my room on silent feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. They were planning to lock me away. They were planning to steal my inheritance. They were planning to erase me from my own life. I was 13 years old, and I had just discovered that the people responsible for my care were my greatest enemies. For the next 6 months, I lived in a state of constant terror. I knew what was coming, but I didn't know when or how. I tried to act normal to avoid giving them any ammunition. I kept my grades up. I stayed out of trouble. I tried to be so perfect, so unremarkable, that they would have no justification for their plans. It wasn't enough. The groundwork was being laid without my knowledge. I later learned that Richard had consulted with a psychiatrist who owed him favors, obtaining a preliminary diagnosis of severe attachment disorder with psychotic features. He had found a facility, a place called the Westbrook Institute, located in a remote area of Romania that specialized in adolescent behavioral rehabilitation. The Westbrook Institute was not a legitimate therapeutic program. It was a place where wealthy families sent children they wanted to disappear. The children who went there were subjected to isolation, psychological manipulation, and sometimes physical abuse, all under the guise of treatment. Some stayed for years. Some never came back at all. The night they took me was exactly 1 week after my 14th birthday. I had gone to bed as usual in the small room at the back of the house that had been designated as mine. I woke to hands holding me down, a cloth pressed over my face, and a sweet, chemical smell that made my thoughts go fuzzy and slow. When I woke again, I was on a plane. The next 3 years were the darkest of my life. The Westbrook Institute was everything the rumors suggested, and worse. It was located in a crumbling Soviet-era building in the Romanian countryside, hours from any major city, surrounded by forests that made escape seem impossible. The program was designed to break us. We were isolated from each other, allowed minimal communication, subjected to therapy sessions that were really just hours of being told how sick we were, how dangerous, how incapable of functioning in normal society. We were given medications that made us docile and compliant. We were punished for any sign of independence or resistance. Some kids gave in. They accepted the narrative that they were broken, that they needed to be here, that their families had done the right thing by sending them away. I watched them become hollow, empty, their spirits crushed under the weight of constant manipulation. I refused to break. Every day I told myself the same thing: this is not forever, this is not who I am. They want me to disappear, but I won't. I will survive this. I will get out, and I will make them pay. I learned to play the game. I pretended to respond to treatment. I said what they wanted to hear in therapy sessions. I took the medications they gave me, then threw them up in the bathroom afterward. I became the model patient, compliant and docile, while inside I was planning and waiting. I also learned other things, things that would prove useful later. The Westbrook Institute was poorly run, its staff underpaid and often corrupt. Information could be bought, rules could be bent, and crucially, the facility's security was not designed to contain someone who was genuinely determined to escape. I made my move 3 months before my 17th birthday. Over the preceding year, I had been secretly accumulating resources. Money stolen, a few coins at a time from staff members' pockets, a small knife hidden in my mattress, a hand-drawn map of the facility and the surrounding area. I had also cultivated a relationship with one of the night guards, a young man named Andre who was disillusioned with his job and susceptible to bribery. The night of my escape, I gave Andre everything I had saved, about $200, a fortune by local standards, in exchange for him looking the other way while I slipped out a side door. I had civilian clothes hidden in my room, and I changed quickly before disappearing into the forest. I walked for 3 days, following roads from a distance, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, eating whatever I could find. I had memorized the location of the nearest city, Cluj-Napoca, and I made my way there with the determination of someone who knew that capture meant returning to hell. In Cluj-Napoca, I found the American consulate. I walked in, dirty and exhausted, and told them who I was and what had happened to me. I showed them the scars on my arms from the therapeutic restraints. I told them about the facility, about the other children still trapped there, about the families who had paid to make their problems disappear. The consulate staff was horrified. They contacted authorities in both Romania and the United States. They arranged for me to be brought back to America. They promised that there would be investigations, consequences, justice. In the end, the Westbrook Institute was shut down. Several staff members were arrested. A few other children were rescued. But for me, the fight was just beginning. I returned to the United States with nothing but the clothes on my back and a burning determination to reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. My grandmother had died while I was imprisoned overseas. I learned this from the consulate staff, who had researched my family situation as part of their investigation. The $50 million that was supposed to be mine had been placed in a trust, with Richard designated as the trustee. And as my legal guardian, and with documentation claiming I was mentally incompetent, Richard had managed to transfer control of those funds to himself. The inheritance my grandmother had intended for me was now, effectively, his. When I returned to the United States, I didn't go back to Richard's house. I would have rather died than spend another moment under his roof. Instead, I used the few resources available to me: emergency assistance from social services, help from advocates who specialized in cases like mine, to establish myself independently. I was 17, legally still a minor, but I had experienced things that made me older than my years. I found a group home for teenagers who had aged out of foster care or escaped abusive situations. I enrolled in a public high school to complete my education. I got a job at a grocery store, working evenings and weekends to save whatever money I could. And I started planning. The first step was getting my legal situation sorted out. I connected with a lawyer who took my case pro bono, recognizing the injustice of what had been done to me. We filed to have me declared competent, to have my guardianship terminated, to regain control of my own life. Richard fought us, of course. He claimed that I had voluntarily entered treatment, that I was still unstable, that I needed continued supervision for my own protection. But he made a critical mistake. He underestimated how much documentation I had accumulated during my time at Westbrook. I had names, I had dates, I had descriptions of the treatment I had received. And most importantly, I had testimony from Andre, the guard who had helped me escape, who was willing to describe what really happened at that facility. The court case was brutal, but in the end, the judge ruled in my favor. I was declared legally competent. My guardianship was terminated, and Richard was ordered to provide a full accounting of how my inheritance had been managed during my incapacity. That accounting revealed what I had suspected. The $50 million was gone. Richard had used it to prop up the family business during a difficult period, to fund his children's educations, to maintain his lifestyle. There was nothing left for me to inherit. The judge expressed outrage. The lawyer filed additional motions. But the practical reality was clear. The money was gone, and getting it back would require years of litigation with uncertain outcomes. I was 18 years old, legally free, and completely broke. Most people would have given up at that point. Most people would have accepted that they had been beaten, that the system was stacked against them, that some injustices simply can't be undone. I am not most people. If I couldn't recover what had been stolen from me through legal channels, I would build something bigger than what I had lost. I would become so successful, so powerful, that my family would be forced to acknowledge how wrong they had been. And then, when they were at their most vulnerable, I would take everything. Pause, let us pause here for a second. Pause. If you're still with me, if Vivian's story is hitting you in the chest, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had people in your life who tried to hold you down, who told you that you weren't good enough, who wanted you to fail? I want to hear from you, because this story is for everyone who has been counted out, everyone who has been written off, everyone who has been told that they don't matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button right now. Bell. We're about to get into the part where Vivian builds her empire, and trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. Now, let's continue. The next 15 years were a masterclass in transformation. I started with nothing, literally nothing. I was living in a group home, working minimum wage jobs, finishing high school at night. I had no connections, no resources, no safety net. But I had something that money couldn't buy: absolute, unwavering determination. And I had the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you're working toward. My first step was education. I knew that without credentials, I would always be limited in what I could achieve. So I studied relentlessly, graduating high school with honors despite working full-time. I applied to every scholarship I could find, writing essay after essay about my experiences and my goals. I got into a state university on a full scholarship. I majored in finance and economics, driven by a desire to understand the systems that people like Richard used to accumulate and protect wealth. I graduated in 3 years instead of 4, taking extra classes every semester. During college, I also started my first business, a small tutoring company that helped high school students prepare for standardized tests. I had learned, during my own educational journey, that there was enormous demand for affordable test prep services. I started by tutoring students myself, then hired other college students as the demand grew. By the time I graduated, the tutoring company was generating over $100,000 in annual revenue. It wasn't a fortune, but it was proof of concept. I could build something from nothing. I could create value where none existed before. After graduation, I took a job at an investment bank, not because I loved banking, but because I wanted to learn how money really worked at the highest levels. I was assigned to the mergers and acquisitions team, where I spent 80-hour weeks analyzing deals, identifying undervalued assets, and learning the art of corporate warfare. I was good at it, very good. Within 3 years, I was one of the top analysts at the firm, with a reputation for seeing opportunities that others missed. But I was also watching, waiting. Every spare moment, I researched the Harrington family's business affairs. I tracked their acquisitions, their debts, their strategic decisions. I identified their weaknesses and filed the information away for future use. At 28, I left the bank to start my own investment firm. I named it Phoenix Capital because I had risen from the ashes of my own destruction. The firm focused on what I knew best: identifying undervalued companies, acquiring them, and transforming them into profitable enterprises. The first few years were difficult. I was young, female, and unknown in an industry dominated by older men with established reputations. I had to fight for every meeting, every deal, every opportunity. But I also had advantages they didn't. I had spent years studying how wealthy families managed their money, and I understood their psychology in ways they didn't understand themselves. I knew how they thought, what they feared, what motivated their decisions, and I used that knowledge ruthlessly. By 30, Phoenix Capital had assets under management exceeding $200 million. By 32, we had crossed the billion-dollar mark. And throughout all of this, I had been quietly positioning myself around the Harrington family's business interests. The Harringtons had diversified since my childhood, expanding from real estate into hospitality, retail, and commercial development. Richard had taken over as CEO of Harrington Enterprises after my grandmother's death, and he had pursued an aggressive growth strategy funded largely by debt. For a while, it worked. The economy was strong, credit was cheap, and the family's reputation opened doors that might otherwise have been closed. But I could see the cracks forming. The debt levels were unsustainable. The new ventures were underperforming projections. And Richard, for all his cunning, was not a particularly good businessman. He was good at manipulating people, good at maintaining appearances, but he lacked the strategic vision needed to navigate a changing market. I began acquiring positions, small stakes in companies that did business with Harrington Enterprises, seats on boards that had influence over Harrington's partners, relationships with bankers and lawyers who handled Harrington affairs. Each move was subtle, untraceable, part of a larger pattern that only I could see. And I waited for my moment. It came when I was 33 years old. The economy had entered a downturn, and Harrington Enterprises was struggling. The debt payments that had seemed manageable in good times were now crushing. Several major projects had stalled, and Richard, desperate to keep the company afloat, had made a series of increasingly risky bets that were now going sour. The family needed an infusion of capital, approximately $80 million, to survive the crisis. Without it, Harrington Enterprises would default on its loans, triggering a cascade of failures that would destroy everything they had built. Richard reached out to every bank, every private equity firm, every wealthy contact he had. But word had spread about Harrington's troubles, and no one wanted to be the one left holding the bag when the company collapsed. There was, however, one firm that expressed interest, a relatively new but rapidly growing investment company called Phoenix Capital, whose founder was known for taking calculated risks on distressed assets. Richard had never heard of Phoenix Capital's founder. He had never heard of me. I had built my empire under my mother's maiden name, Vivian Rhodes, erasing any connection to the Harrington family. When his lawyers reached out to my lawyers to arrange a meeting, I agreed immediately. But I set the terms. The meeting would be held at my offices, on my schedule, with no advance disclosure of who the other party was meeting with. Richard agreed. He was desperate, and desperate people don't negotiate. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in October. I had spent weeks preparing, not just the financial analysis, though that was comprehensive, but the psychological staging. I wanted this meeting to be a performance, a revelation that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. My offices occupied the top floor of a building that I owned in the financial district. The conference room where the meeting would be held had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive art on the walls, and a table made of reclaimed wood from a demolished church, a subtle symbol of resurrection and transformation. I was seated at the head of that table, reviewing documents, when Richard Harrington walked in. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, heavier, with the worn expression of a man who was watching his life's work crumble. He was accompanied by his wife, Patricia, and their two children, Alexander, now in his mid-30s, and Charlotte, now 32. They had brought the whole family. Perhaps they thought it would make them more sympathetic. Perhaps they wanted to demonstrate that this was a family business worth saving. They had no idea what they were walking into. "Mr. Harrington," my assistant announced, "this is Vivian Rhodes, founder and CEO of Phoenix Capital." I stood and turned to face them. The recognition wasn't immediate. 16 years had passed, and I had changed, not just physically, but in presence, in bearing, in the way I carried myself. I was no longer the frightened teenager they had thrown away. I was a woman who had conquered every obstacle placed in her path. But Patricia was the first to see it. I watched her face cycle through confusion, then disbelief, then horror as the pieces clicked into place. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You're dead, institutionalized, rotting in some Romanian hellhole." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Aunt Patricia. I'm very much alive, and I'm very much in control of whether your family survives the next 6 months." Richard had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. "Please," I said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the table. Sit down. We have a lot to discuss. No one moved. I said sit down. My voice was calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. They sat. I remained standing, looking down at them the way they had once looked down at me. 16 years ago, you drugged me, put me on a plane, and shipped me to a facility designed to break children's spirits. You told everyone I was mentally disturbed. You stole my inheritance. You erased me from my own family. I paused, letting the words sink in. You did this because you thought I was weak. You thought I was helpless. You thought I was a problem that could be disposed of. I leaned forward, placing my palms flat on the table. You were wrong. The room was completely silent. Charlotte was staring at me with something that might have been terror. Alexander was looking at his father, as if waiting for Richard to somehow fix this situation. Patricia was crying silently, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. And Richard was doing calculations. I could see it in his eyes, the desperate mental arithmetic of a man trying to figure out how to salvage something from a catastrophe. Vivian, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Whatever happened in the past, we're family. And families find ways to work through their difficulties. Perhaps we can come to some arrangement that benefits everyone. An arrangement, I repeated. You want to make a deal with me. You're a businesswoman. You understand that emotions don't belong in business decisions. Whatever your feelings about the past, the fact remains that Harrington Enterprises is a valuable company with strong fundamentals. The right investment could. Let me stop you there, I said, holding up a hand. I'm not interested in your sales pitch. I've been studying your company for years. I know its value better than you do, and I know exactly how much trouble you're in. I opened a folder and began laying out documents on the table. You're 3 months behind on debt payments totaling $18 million. You have another $22 million coming due in the next quarter that you have no way of paying. Your commercial properties are operating at 40% vacancy. Your retail division is hemorrhaging money. And your hospitality ventures have been losing ground to competitors for the past 4 years. Richard's face grew more ashen with each revelation. In short, I continued, your company is dying. Without a massive infusion of capital and a complete overhaul of your management strategy, you'll be in bankruptcy within a year. And when that happens, you'll lose everything. The properties, the businesses, the houses, the trust funds you've set up for your children, all of it. Then invest, Richard said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. You have the capital. You just said the company has value. Make the investment, save the company, and we'll all profit. I could do that, I acknowledged. I have the resources. I have the expertise. I could turn Harrington Enterprises around and make it more profitable than it's ever been. I paused. But why would I? Because it's good business. Is it? From a pure financial perspective, letting your company fail might be more advantageous to me. I've already positioned myself to acquire several of your most valuable assets in a bankruptcy scenario. I could pick apart the corpse of Harrington Enterprises and add the best pieces to my own portfolio at a fraction of their real value. I sat down, crossing my legs and leaning back in my chair. So let me ask you again, why should I save you? Richard looked at his wife, at his children, at the documents spread across the table. For the first time since I had known him, he looked truly afraid. Because we're family, Charlotte said suddenly. Her voice was shaky, but she met my eyes directly. I know we treated you badly, Vivian. I know we did terrible things, but you're still a Harrington. And doesn't that mean anything? I studied her for a long moment. Does it? Did being a Harrington mean anything when I was 14, and you were helping your parents convince everyone I was crazy? Did it mean anything when you told your friends that I had to be sent away because I was dangerous? Did it mean anything when you took my bedroom and my belongings and my place in this family without a second thought? Charlotte flinched but didn't look away. I was 16. I did what my parents told me. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was really happening. You didn't want to understand. None of you did. It was easier to believe I was broken than to question what you were benefiting from. I stood up again and walked to the window, looking out at the city that I had conquered without their help. But you're right about one thing. I am a Harrington, whether I want to be or not. And that means I understand something about this family that outsiders never could. I turned back to face them. I understand that you'll do anything to protect your position. I understand that you're capable of cruelty that most people can't even imagine. And I understand that if I save you now, without conditions, you'll find a way to betray me again as soon as it's convenient. We wouldn't, Richard started. Yes, you would. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. I returned to my seat and opened another folder. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you a choice, the same kind of choice you never gave me. And what you choose will determine whether your family survives or falls. I laid out a document, a legal contract, dense with terms and conditions. Option 1, I invest the $80 million you need. In exchange, I take controlling interest in Harrington Enterprises, 60%, with full authority over strategic decisions. Richard, you step down as CEO immediately. I install my own management team. The family retains a minority stake and can share in the profits if the company recovers, but you no longer have any control. Richard's jaw tightened. That's not an option, that's a hostile takeover. It's a bailout, a generous one, considering the circumstances. But if you don't like option 1, there's option 2. I laid out a second document. Option 2, I walk away. I let Harrington Enterprises fail. I acquire the pieces I want in bankruptcy court, and your family loses everything. You'll be starting over from scratch. No properties, no businesses, no wealth. Just the clothes on your back and whatever sympathy you can scrape together from people who used to respect you. I sat back. Those are your options. There is no option 3. The room erupted. Richard was on his feet, shouting about blackmail and extortion. Patricia was sobbing about how unfair this was. Alexander was threatening to call lawyers, to file complaints, to somehow reverse this situation through sheer force of outrage. I let them rage. I sat quietly, checking my phone, waiting for the storm to burn itself out. Eventually, they exhausted themselves. Richard collapsed back into his chair, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. There has to be another way, he said weakly. Some compromise. There isn't. I've spent 16 years building to this moment. Do you think I would have left any loopholes? I leaned forward, dropping my voice to something almost gentle. You have 60 seconds to decide. After that, I'm walking out of this room, and option 1 disappears forever. 60 seconds. Patricia was incredulous. You can't make a decision like this in 60 seconds. You made a decision about my entire life in less time than that. You decided to throw me away like garbage, and you didn't lose a moment's sleep over it. Now it's my turn to decide, and I'm being generous by giving you a choice at all. I looked at my watch. Starting now. The next minute was excruciating. I watched my family, the people who had tormented me, abandoned me, stolen from me, grapple with the reality of their powerlessness. They whispered frantically among themselves. Richard argued with Patricia, Alexander paced by the window, Charlotte sat frozen with her head in her hands. At 55 seconds, I started to stand. Wait, Richard's voice was raw, broken. We accept. Option 1, we accept. I sat back down. Wise choice. The signing took another hour. My lawyers appeared with additional documents, capturing every detail in binding legal language. Richard signed where he was told to sign, his hand shaking slightly with each stroke of the pen. Patricia signed. Alexander and Charlotte signed as representatives of their trust interests. By the end, I owned 60% of Harrington Enterprises. I had the power to make any decision about the company without consulting any of them. and I had achieved what I had been working toward for 16 years, complete control over the family that had tried to destroy me. As they were gathering their things to leave, I spoke one more time. "One more thing before you go." They froze, clearly expecting some final cruelty. "The $50 million that my grandmother left to me. The inheritance you stole while I was locked away in Romania." Richard's face went grey. "That money is gone. We don't have. I'm not asking for it back. I don't need it. What I need is acknowledgement." I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. "You're going to record a statement. Each of you, individually. You're going to describe exactly what you did to me. The institutionalization, the fraud, the theft. You're going to acknowledge that I was not mentally ill, that the diagnosis was fabricated, that you sent me away solely to gain control of my inheritance." "That would be a confession to multiple crimes," Alexander protested. "We could go to prison." "Yes, you could, which is why these recordings will remain in my possession, to be released only if you ever attempt to betray me again. Consider it insurance." Patricia was shaking her head. "You're asking us to put a gun to our own heads." "I'm asking you to do what you should have done years ago, tell the truth. And if you can't bring yourselves to do that," I shrugged, "option 2 is still available. I can tear up these contracts right now." The recordings took another 30 minutes. One by one, my family members sat in front of my phone camera and confessed to what they had done to me. Richard admitted to arranging the false diagnosis, to bribing the psychiatrist, to contacting the Westbrook Institute. Patricia described her role in selecting the facility and preparing the cover story. Charlotte acknowledged that she had suspected the truth but chosen not to question it. Only Alexander claimed ignorance, and his claim was believable enough that I allowed it. He had been away at college when I was taken, and his parents had apparently kept him out of the details. When it was over, I had 4 confessions on my phone and complete control over my family's fate. "We're done here," I said. "You can go." They filed out in silence, not looking at me, not speaking to each other. The door closed behind them, and I was alone in my conference room, surrounded by the evidence of my victory. I sat there for a long time, waiting to feel something. Triumph, maybe, satisfaction, the catharsis of justice finally served. What I felt instead was empty, not dissatisfied. I had done what I set out to do, achieved what I had spent 16 years working toward. But the victory felt hollow, like I had been running toward a destination that turned out to be less meaningful than the journey itself. I had beaten them, I had taken everything, and now I was left with a question I hadn't anticipated. What comes next? The next year was about rebuilding, both Harrington Enterprises and myself. I threw myself into the work of turning the company around. New management, new strategy, new systems. Within 6 months, we had stabilized the debt situation. Within a year, we were profitable again. I also began the work of turning the company's focus towards something more meaningful. Under my direction, Harrington Enterprises established a foundation dedicated to helping young people who had been through experiences similar to mine. Survivors of abusive, therapeutic programs, children who had been exploited by systems meant to protect them. We funded legal advocacy, provided scholarships, and supported organizations working to reform the troubled teen industry. My family remained in the picture, at least technically. They held their minority stake, attended the quarterly meetings, collected their dividend checks. But they had no power, no influence, no ability to affect decisions. They were passengers on a train I was driving. The dynamic between us was strange. We were cordial at meetings, professional in communications, but there was no warmth and no pretense of family feeling. We had seen each other's true faces, and there was no going back from that. Charlotte was the only one who made an attempt to bridge the gap. 6 months after the takeover, she requested a private meeting. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what she could possibly have to say. We met at a cafe near my office, neutral territory. She looked different than she had at the confrontation, less polished, more vulnerable, like someone who had been doing genuine soul-searching. "I've been in therapy," she said, not waiting for small talk, "trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could participate in what we did to you, trying to understand how I justified it to myself all those years." I sipped my coffee, waiting. I don't have good answers. I told myself stories, that you really were troubled, that you needed help we couldn't provide, that sending you away was merciful. But deep down, I think I knew. I just didn't want to know, because knowing would have meant giving up my comfortable life. And now I'm trying to be different. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I don't expect it. I'm just asking for, I don't know, a chance to be better, to prove that I'm not defined by the worst thing I ever did. I studied her face, looking for the calculation, the manipulation, the angle. I didn't find it. What I found instead was something I recognized, the desperate desire to become someone other than who you were raised to be. "I'm not ready to trust you," I said finally. "I may never be, but I'm willing to leave the door open. If you're serious about being different, show me over time. Actions matter more than words." Charlotte nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you, that's more than I deserve." Our relationship since then has been cautious but real. We talk occasionally. We've had dinners where the conversation touched on something resembling honesty. I wouldn't call us close, but I would say that she's become something like a person to me, rather than just a symbol of everything I had lost. As for Richard and Patricia, they have never attempted reconciliation. They attend meetings with rigid formality, do what they're told, and disappear immediately afterward. I suspect they still hate me. I suspect they still believe, somewhere in their hearts, that they did nothing wrong. But their beliefs don't matter anymore. Only their actions matter, and their actions are now completely within my control. Looking back at everything, I sometimes wonder what my grandmother would think if she could see what I've become. She wanted to protect me. She left me that inheritance because she knew her son Richard was dangerous, knew that I would need resources to escape his control. She did everything in her power to ensure I would be taken care of. And I was taken care of, just not in the way she intended. Her inheritance was stolen, but the fire it ignited in me built something far more valuable. I became strong because I had no choice but to be strong. I became successful because failure meant letting them win. In a strange way, I owe my family for who I am today. Not gratitude, never that, but acknowledgement. They gave me the greatest gift an enemy can give: total, unwavering motivation to become unstoppable. Last month, I visited my parents' grave for the first time since I returned to America. I had avoided it for years, afraid of what it would feel like, afraid that I would fall apart in a way I couldn't afford. But I was finally ready to face the pain that I had been carrying since I was 7 years old. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful, nothing like the chaos of my memories. My parents were buried side by side, under a simple marker that bore their names and the words, "Beloved Parents." I stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing. "I made it," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They tried to destroy me, but I made it. I built something you would have been proud of. I became someone who can't be pushed around, can't be dismissed, can't be thrown away." I wiped tears from my cheeks, tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in decades. "I wish you had been there. I wish you could have seen me grow up, seen me struggle, seen me succeed. I wish you could have been at my graduation, at my first business deal, at all the moments that mattered." I knelt down and touched the grass above their grave. "But you're with me anyway. Everything good in me came from you. The strength, the determination, the refusal to give up, that's your gift. And I carry it every day." I stayed until the sun started to set, saying goodbye to the parents I had lost and hello to the person I had become. Clap aboard, and that's where we'll end this story. For now, clap aboard. If you made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're part of this journey. You're someone who understands what it means to fight, to survive, to become something greater than what people expected of you. Where in the world are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your location in the comments. Whether you're in New York or New Delhi, London or Lagos, Sydney or Sao Paulo, I want to know. Let's see how far this story has reached. And I want you to answer this question in the comments. If you had the power to confront someone who wronged you, to hold all the cards for once, what would you do? Would you take everything? Would you offer forgiveness? Would you walk away? There are no wrong answers, just honest ones. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment. So smash that subscribe button, oncoming fist. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a like if this video made you feel something. And share this with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to rise from the ashes.